And welcome everyone to the new webinar of the Middle East Council on Global Affairs on Turkey's new regional policy. Today we'll try to understand the new dynamics and new trends that is shaping and informing Turkey's regional policy, Turkey's Middle East policy. We have actually a stellar lineup of speakers here with us. We have Evren Balta from the Özyeğin University. We have Alper Coskun from Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and we have Guney Yildiz, doctoral researcher at Cambridge University. Today, with our speakers, will try to understand all dynamics and dimensions of Turkey's new regional policy, from the domestic drivers of this policy to the policy of reset with the Arab Gulf states and Israel, but also the new escalation dynamics that we are seeing in Turkey's regional policy, particularly towards its immediate neighborhood in Iraq, Syria, and regional Kurdish geopolitics, but also competition with Iran and Greece. So for the audience, please bear in mind there is an Arabic option as well too. So you can see the Arabic channel under the interpretation icon. So please press the Arabic channels if you would like to follow the events in Arabic, because this is like both English and Arabic events. So the icon is there. And also, if you have any questions, please post your question to the Q&A under the Q&A icon. So I will be posing your question to the speakers if you put up there. So without further ado, I would like to actually go to our speakers and get the conversation started immediately. So Evren, let me start with you, because whenever recently we are discussing Turkey's regional policy or foreign policy in general, there is an immediate questions coming up about the domestic drivers of it, the domestic goal of it. So could you please a bit, talk about the domestic dynamics of Turkey's new regional policy or the foreign policy in general?
Okay, sure. I mean, first of all, thanks for inviting me, Galip. But let me start with a very general observation. It's not just about Turkey, but foreign policy is almost always, for every country, is about domestic policy, and in two ways. And this is also shaping Turkish foreign policy right now, these two ways. The first one is that foreign policy is a site projecting domestic political needs and ideas in a given structural and systemic constraints, of course. And second, foreign policy is an instrument of leaders in pursuing their domestic and national commitments, aspirations, you can say. In terms of the first one, foreign policy being a site of projecting domestic political needs and ideas, I would like to first mention Turkish economy, which has been coming up a lot in the recent discussions on the change of the course of the Turkish foreign policy. Turkish foreign policy, as I said, right now, more and more projecting the needs of Turkish economy. And this has been not something new, of course. Turkish foreign policy, of course, throughout the 20th century, in the first 2 decades of 21st century, strongly shaped by the needs of the Turkish economy. Specifically, I mean, when we look at the patterns, foreign debt and lending to secure the public projects, for example, has been an important component of Turkish foreign policy. In the last 30 years, the need for foreign direct investment and foreign portfolio investment has become really important components of Turkish foreign policy, as well as a result of the financialization of the global economy. So the need for these three types of foreign funds are increasing currently in Turkey because of Turkey's current economic crisis, as everyone pretty much here, or everyone who is interested in Turkish foreign policy knows, or Turkish domestic politics knows. Turkey has been going through a very deep structural economic crisis, which is also a crisis of its developmental model. And this has been, the need for funds are increasing also because of Turkey's incoming elections, which is going to happen in 6 months. And elections means that Turkish government, the incumbents government needs to secure funds to continue public spending. So these are important components that the economy has been shaping Turkish foreign policy more recently. But at the same time, the need for diversification of foreign funds and seeking new lenders is, I'm sorry, I have to close this down, I forgot. Sorry. Seeking for diversification of lenders, funding resources is also becoming more and more important for Turkey's domestic considerations, and also, as I said, foreign policy. And this is a result of first Turkey's autocratization path and deinstitutionalization really dried up traditional resources of Turkey, specifically the Western funds. So Turkey needed to diversify its lenders. In the last 10 years or so, China, Russia, Gulf states became the important lenders of Turkey and substituted the West. And this was very important because these types of funding usually came to Turkey without political conditionality. And this had a very important component, as I said, when you consider the autocratization path of Turkey, the external element of democratization that comes with funding really disappeared and substituted with different lenders. Turkey, as I said, not just to diversify because of this current economic crisis, but not just that, as I said, it's a pattern, also needs to diversify its investment and trade portfolio, new markets to invest, such as Turkey's African foreign policy, which is strictly related to this idea of Africa being a new market for Turkey, construction firms, textiles industry, and this and that, or strengthen the old markets or traditional markets, strengthen the trade with the traditional markets, like the markets with Europe has also become an important back to the political discourse in Turkey as a result of the economic crisis. And I also need to mention the fact that different sectors have different needs. And they have different needs of access or different access needs to do trade or investment. I can mention here construction sector, energy sector, defense sector, tourism sector, which comes a lot of lobbying to how to say. And I mean, they do a lot of lobbying to Erdogan, basically, to the leadership, and that also affects foreign policy as well. So that's first component. I mean, the needs of the Turkish economy has been shaping a lot Turkey's changing foreign policy priorities. And this idea that new markets, new trade, secure funds has been an important component of the foreign policy. Another component of foreign policy as a side of projecting domestic needs and ideas is related to security perceptions. Like every state, Turkish state has a long established sense of itself and ontological anxieties. And ontological anxieties around that self perception. We usually refer to serf syndrome when we say ontological anxieties, which has two components. The first component is the deep anxiety with the minorities in Turkey, specifically Kurds. And second, a deep anxiety with the intentions of the Western actors, specifically targeting Turkey's territorial integrity. And more recently, in the last decade or so, after the Syrian crisis and after the events in Iraq, these two anxieties really came together and strengthened the Turkey's ontological security anxiety, basically. And domestically, the political project of the AKP to resolve the Kurdish question through a more unitary, homogeneous Muslim identity collapsed around 2015, and Kurds emerged as political actors on their own and challenged the incumbent government. So right now, Turkey still pursues an active Syria policy, mostly out of domestic concerns to secure its border, to create a safe zone, to create a more, like the safe zone, meaning that demographically not predominantly Kurdish areas alongside the Turkey-Syrian border and this and that. Very broadly, I would say, to conclude, Turkish foreign policy is an outcome of interaction right now, basically. I mean, we can come up with different factors and analysis as well, but right now Turkish foreign policy is very broadly could be explained as an outcome of the interaction of these two major and conflicting domestic political concerns. On the one side, you have economic needs, and that means more rational, engaged, calculated foreign policy. You need to engage with more actors. But also the second concern, which is the security, requires really and also the regime security really is about, no political conditionalities, ontological security is more important than the economic calculations and maybe economic rationality. And sometimes you see these two different mentalities or rationalities of foreign policy clashing each other, creating diverging interests, or how to say, conflicting behaviors and patterns in Turkish foreign policy, and shifts basically that we have been experiencing in Turkish foreign policy as well. One more thing, then I'll stop. As I said, the foreign policy could also be used as an instrument domestically, and that could be also done in two ways, and I can expand this idea in the Q&A or maybe in the second tour, but the two ways that I'm mentioning here, that foreign policy can be used as this idea of, like a strong state as a continuation of strong leadership at home. So it's a populist foreign policy, let me say differently, populist domestic foreign policy could be a continuation of populist domestic politics abroad. So you can see that continuity and the style and discourse as well. And the second one is that something that we keep mentioning in international relations, really around the flag effect, when the elections approaching, political leaders usually become more aggressive in their foreign policy, become more adventurous in their foreign policy in order to secure more votes or consolidate their power, which I think it may not be the case in these elections, but still it could be used, foreign policy could be used as an instrument. So let me stop here.
Well, thank you. Actually, let me ask you a very follow-up question, because you left at a place which generates many questions with elections, because when it comes to diversifying funding sources, the question of diversifying funding sources, many CSTs also very much related to the economy needs prior to the upcoming elections. Mm-hmm. So to what extent the pressing economic needs in the run-up to the elections informs the current foreign policy now?
Say again the second part of the question.
To what extent the economic needs as we go to the elections right now informs the foreign policy choices?
I think a lot, because what we have been seeing in the polls is that economy is really has become one of the most important components of voters' decisions, whether to vote for the government or not. So Turkey's economic well-being, which is, I mean, not going to go back to what it was 5 years ago, obviously, but at least the government needs to, the Turkish government wants to secure enough funds to distribute to the public before the elections. We'll be seeing pretty much, we have been seeing it, but we'll keep seeing it. There is a lot of resource allocation, distribution of public funds to the public, increase in wages, salaries, health expenditures, and many sorts of, public expenditures has been increasing and under inflationary tendencies. But this is mostly because the government sees that economy is the major factor to win the elections. So in order to keep doing that, you need external funds. And maybe again, we can talk about this. So that's one of the most important components of Turkey's foreign policy with Russia, or bilateral relations with Russia. And also,
but in any case, as we indicated, this is a very interesting shift. Previously, when we discussed the economy, Turkey trying to find ways to tackle its economic crisis, we would be mostly talking with reference to different Western countries. Now, the fact that we are talking about, like, the Gulf countries, China or Russia in itself is an important shift in Turkey's context, maybe an important shift in the global context, a reflection of an important shift in global context.
That's one of the most important global shifts, because these funds usually come, as I said, with conditionalities when it comes from the West, mostly political conditionalities and democratic conditionality. And that was the external impetus for democratization or institutionalization. It seems that now it's gone because of the diverse funders in the global in the international sphere. So I think that's an important component of the transformation of the international system.
Absolutely. Let me now move to the Ambassador Coskun. Alper Bey, if you are an outsider, when you look at the Turkish regional policy now, you see two contrasting picture. One of them, reconciliation and mending ties. Another one is, escalation and potential military operations. But let's discuss first this reset part, the reconciliation part with the Arab Gulf states. So what are the drivers, goals, but also scorecard of this reset with the Arab Gulf states and Israel? Because we see two different pictures. Like with the UAE, it seems unusually it was quick, the reconciliation process. With Egypt, it seems that, it's taking time, it's slower. So how do you see it?
Yes, Galip Bey, thank you, and greetings to my co-panelists as well as to our listeners. Thank you. It's really a privilege to be with you today. Evren laid out very well the domestic dynamics behind the reset that's taking place in Turkish foreign policy. Clearly, particularly since roughly the end of 2021, we've been seeing signals from Turkey that a recalibration of Turkey's policy, both vis-a-vis the Gulf states, namely and particularly the UAE and Saudi Arabia, as well as towards Egypt and Israel, was taking place. Now, when it comes to why this happened, why Turkey has decided to recalibrate in this manner, I think there are three main drivers. The first reason, in my view, is a sobering assessment that has taken hold in Ankara to the effect that the policy of alienation, if you will, for lack of a better word, of Turkey and countries like the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt, has not served Turkey's interest. Turkey's come to realize that this policy has not worked and that it has not furthered Ankara's interests. Of course, the dynamics in which these relations have developed or have broken down throughout the years have been different. There's also Syria that we need to bear in mind, the recent conversations that we've been hearing about possible engagements at high levels with President Assad, for example, that he has said he's not ready to do very recently, by the way. But all of these have different dynamics. In the case of Syria, it was an amazing roller coaster where Öcalan found refuge in this country, and it was one of Turkey's greatest security challenges. and then it was able to transform itself with coercive diplomacy and a little bit of muscle flexing on the part of Turkey to a regional partner where both parties were talking about the number of agreements that they signed in one round, 30 or 40, I forget the numbers, and security cooperation was thriving, and so on and so forth. And, you know, ironically, in 2011, I went to Damascus as the Deputy Director General of Security and Intelligence at the Foreign Ministry to talk about security cooperation with Syria. We were at that stage, at one small window. And then it came to regime change and Turkey advocating this through proxies. So that roller coaster is there. Whereas in Egypt, it was a different dynamic, obviously, where Turkey decided to put its eggs in the same basket as a political movement, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And it did so not only in Egypt, but also other countries like Tunisia and Algeria. So that was a different dynamic there. And then there were different dynamics surrounding the UAE and Saudi Arabia. So it's important to remember the fact that there are different backgrounds, and obviously with Israel, since the Davos issue and then the Mavi Marmara incident and so on. So, but overall, I think the cumulative effect of the alienation that Turkey has had in its relations, because of many of the policy choices that Ankara has made, but obviously because of reasons coming from, in some ways, coming from these countries as well. At the end of the day, this alienation has not served Turkey's interest. So it's that sobering realization in Ankara that I think is the first driver. A related second element, I think, is the realization again in Ankara that the isolation in the region and beyond, that this reality in the international sphere has dragged Turkey into, again, has not served Turkey's interest. And this is something that clearly, because of a variety of reasons, I'm focusing here more on the international relations aspect, but obviously there are dimensions, as Evren mentioned, in terms of receiving funds to Turkey and so on. But the overall picture and that overall isolation, I think it has been, which was glorified at one point in Turkey, as you might remember, as something being fabulous, if you will, which was really a romantic way of trying to describe Turkey's weakness, if you will, and the assessment that this isolation no longer serves Turkey's interests and needs to be, this dynamic needs to be changed, I think was the second major driver. And the third, again, related element, I think, is a more particular reason, and that has to do with Greece. In this case, I think it's fair to say that all roads lead to Athens, as far as Ankara is concerned. We see this particularly in Turkey's attempt to mend fences with Egypt. We've seen this in the statements of President Erdogan and others when speaking about the need to mend fences with Egypt. The subtext is always the fact that in the Eastern Mediterranean, Greece has benefited, and it doesn't make sense for Egypt to be in groupings that are against Turkey, which again, obviously, is a reference to Greece. So those, I believe, are the three main elements as to why this major recalibration and turnabout in policy is taking place in Turkey. As far as its objectives, which are very similar, obviously, to the drivers, I think the main objective is to end Greece's free reign in the neighborhood with Israel, with Egypt, with the United Arab Emirates, as we saw. There were UAE fighter jets taking part in military exercises with Greece, clearly as a challenge to Turkey. So to end all of those dynamics, and then of course you have to think of the increasing or deepening cooperation, particularly in the defense sector between Greece and the United States, between Greece and France. So all these elements are building blocks that have led to a sense of isolation on the part of Turkey that do not serve its interests. So the need to end this free reign that Greece has been masterfully benefiting and implementing is, I think, an important driver. A second important element, not driver, but objective. And a second objective is related to what Evren mentioned, which is to ensure that the flow of funds from these countries, particularly the Gulf states, can be facilitated. I have one caveat there, though. When we were talking about the flow of funds, we spoke about Western funds coming with conditionality and funds from elsewhere not coming with conditionality. That's actually not the case. It's quite clear that any Chinese fund will come with the unwritten conditionality of turning a blind eye to the Uyghur issue, any funds coming from Saudi Arabia have already translated into policy changes on the part of Turkey. Look at the Khashoggi case. So funds coming from elsewhere will come with conditionality no matter what. And the dilemma that Turkey is facing in that regard, I'd like to add, with a little bit of a tangent from our topic, is the fact that the Turkish economy is overwhelmingly integrated into the Western economy. So that type of structural change in terms of looking for funds from elsewhere, it may only be a stopgap, but I think that is the objective of the government currently going into the elections, to stopgap its financial challenges. And I think the last objective in this overall transformation, again, something Evren mentioned, is to be able to design some foreign policy success story that can be sold to the public opinion, which I do not believe will be enough to change the dynamics on the ground, because it's more about the economy, about inflation, about food prices in Turkey. So I don't believe that any foreign policy success story, even escalatory language vis-a-vis Greece, will be enough to deviate from the realities of the day and what is really challenging the minds and the daily lives of Turkish citizens as we head towards elections next year. I'll stop there, Galip. Thank you.
Can I actually ask a question? Because the word isolation was key, and then the word isolation inevitably, as you put it, was related to Turkey's position in İsmet in particular. The fact that Turkey previously was isolated and it was facing a group of countries, not like, bilaterally Greece alone. So given the recent reconciliation attempts with the Arab Gulf states, do you see more prospect for Turkey being brought into the Eastern Mediterranean Energy Forum, Gas Forum, anytime soon? And related to this as well, how do you see the reconciliation process with Egypt to move forward? Because with Egypt, there are more serious geopolitical files that needs to be resolved, be it Libya, be it Ethiopia, İsmet, even to some extent Algeria. So should we anticipate any swift diplomatic breakthrough with Egypt, or not really?
Yes, well, I think the real challenge for Turkey is that this recalibration in its foreign policy posturing and its rhetoric and its active engagement is not taking place at a point in time where Turkey is viewed to be in a strong position. What I'm trying to say is that Turkey is trying to recalibrate its foreign policy from a point of weakness. The reason why I say this is because when external actors look at Turkey and this recalibration that we're talking about, they attribute it to the fact that Turkey has found itself isolated, that it has found itself disadvantaged in the region in terms of its international relations. And then on top of that is the economic reality of the country. So these elements, unfortunately, make it more difficult for Turkey to come to the table with its interlocutors and to coerce, if you will, the course of this recalibration in a manner that serves Turkey's interest more than it does its interlocutors' interest. And we see the outcome of this quite clearly, I believe, both in the case of, for example, Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Yes, it seems that Saudi Arabia will be providing some funds to Turkey, but I don't think it is at the level that Ankara was hoping for. That, in my opinion, is a calculated bet on the part of Saudi Arabia that President Erdogan might win the election, but with the caveat that he may not, which is why there's a little bit of trickling funds, but it's not overdone. Whereas in Putin's case, for example, I think he's put all of his eggs in the Erdogan basket. On the part of Egypt, it's interesting, and Turkey's isolation, we need to take a step back and understand what it is we're talking about. Through its policies, Turkey has relegated itself from a country, a status where it was able to try and negotiate peace between Syria and Israel. And it had a relatively fair potential to do so because of its ability to access both parties and because of the confidence that it enjoyed in both capitals. It's been relegated from that status to a status where to rebuild its relations with Egypt, with whom we have hundreds of years of relationship, it needs a facilitator third party, in that case, it was Qatar. So that explains to you from where and to what level Turkey's weight in the neighborhood, I think, has diminished. So that is a great challenge. Now, when you think of that background, it's hard to assume that Greece and Cyprus, in this case, since we're talking about the East Mediterranean gas forum, would allow Turkey to break into that closed club of countries that was particularly designed by Athens and Nicosia to make sure that Turkey is excluded. Egypt was part of that design. I don't think those countries would be willing magically to give away that advantage. So I don't see an immediate breakthrough. As far as Egypt is concerned, Libya will be the most outstanding challenge. I think that continues to be the case. To the extent that Egypt perceives Turkish presence and influence in Libya, it will continue to be a thorn in the relationship. If both countries have enough confidence in each other, theoretically, they can use their influence on the ground to provide a breakthrough maybe in the political negotiation process in Libya, but that might be a little bit too optimistic of an expectation at this point in time. But that potential does exist, and actually Ibrahim alluded to that recently on a TV channel.
Well, thank you very much. Guney, Alper Bey talked about the reset context, but I think more recently the Turkish foreign policy was under the spotlight, particularly in the recent few weeks, was because of a new potential military operation to Syria, with particular focus on the Syrian Kurdish PYD-YPG. So how do you see the future of potential flashpoints in Turkey's new regional policy, particularly as reference to Iraq, Syria, but most importantly, Syrian regional Kurdish geopolitics?
Thank you very much, Galip, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be among such distinguished guests. Yes, we've talked about domestic drivers of reset, rapprochement, and also regional drivers of external drivers of the reset. But I think reset and escalation, we need to, I find it more useful to bring them together and talk about them together, right? Because the reasons for escalation are eliminated for the reasons for reset too. I think one is done to mitigate the other. And it's a very good, useful question to kick off the discussion, but we need to, I think, ask some even further questions. So reset, like, is it a reset to factory settings for Turkey, like the Turkish foreign policy between 1950s and until early 2000s? Is it a reset to the Davutoğlu era, where like the motto was the zero problems with neighbors? Or is it a reset to pre-Arab Spring, especially when it comes to relations with the Gulf and Egypt? Or is it a rapprochement? And if it's an escalation, but against whom and with whom? So the escalation, I think there's a more clear aspect, clear answer. It's mostly, and at the center stage we have the Kurds of this escalation. Broadly the PKK and their affiliates in Iraq and Syria, and potentially there's also an unavoidable competition with Iran. And the domestic, Evren Hocam mentioned, laid it very well about the economic aspects of the drivers, but Turkey's own question, own Kurdish question, which is Turkey's Achilles heel, I think is also one of the drivers of the main drivers of the both internally and externally this strategy of escalation. The Turkish government at the moment looks like mixing electioneering with a counter-insurgency strategy. This new counter-insurgency strategy is more in line with the counter-insurgency manuals designed by the US and UK. So both trying to win hearts and minds as well as cracking down militarily. Externally, the question I ask is, why to try to understand the drivers is why Turkey didn't go into Syria. That incursion didn't take place in May and June. You may remember, like, Turkey amassed troops, thousands of troops on the border. Erdogan was saying that the attack is imminent, but it never materialized. What has changed between May and now? I think one of the aspects is regional. Today in May, what happened was I recently spoke to Western officials, both from the EU and from the US side. Let me say sources. And what I understood was that it wasn't necessarily the West that stopped Turkey going into Syria. And from Russia, we had conflicting messages from Lavrov, almost supporting the Foreign Minister Lavrov, and Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zaharova criticizing Turkish action. But there wasn't a strong backlash, political backlash from Russia. And Turkey has been giving what Russia wants on other policy files, from Ukraine to other places. So it wasn't the West, it wasn't necessarily Russia that prevented Turkey from going in, but one country that was more, significantly opposing Turkish intervention in Syria was Iran. And Iran was, when Russia had to evacuate some of the military outposts in Syria, it was the Iranian soldiers, IRGC, or pro-Iranian militias that filled in those vacuums, and Iran wouldn't want that, Turkey to, have a strong influence over the region. Today, Iran has its own Kurdish problem. The domestic almost uprising against the regime is centered in the Kurdistan region of Iran, and that has created one of the potential opportunity for Turkey to go into Syria, and the Kurds strangely are at the center stage in Iran, center stage in Syrian conflict, and the center stage politically in Turkey. Where they are the ones who can determine at least who is not going to be the winner of the next elections. In Iraq, I think the Kurds are coming more, or Kurdistan region of Iraq, Kurds are more coming more on the Turkish orbit increasingly. How sustainable is this, and what kind would be the reactions is another issue. Up until now, Turkey's policies against the PKK, both across the region, was actually a working strategy. I would argue that Turkey was benefiting from the status quo with drones plus intelligence, targeting PKK cadres in both places. It was a working strategy, severely curtailing PKK activity in Syria. I mean, the PKK cadres within the YPG. Now, what Turkey is doing it has the risk of causing the PKK PKK dominates ideologically these regions, but also politically dominate these regions. And more and more Syrian Arabs and the Kurds would look into the conflict in Kurdistan region of Iraq between the PKK and Turkey. And so the support for the PKK will definitely increase. That would be one of the implications. And there are also problems associated with replacing the PKK. So Turkey's counterinsurgency strategy against the PKK is working on this economic term, the law of diminishing returns. So with the current strategy that brought down the PKK activity to a certain level has benefited the Turkish government a lot. But from now on, if you push it further, then there will be a vacuum, and that vacuum might not necessarily benefit regional actors, which can interfere and to change the balance of forces between the two. And secondly, the PKK can also transform their strategy into a way that they wouldn't necessarily confront with Turkish technology, which is more influential, which is more effective in rural areas than in urban areas. So both, in Syria and broadly, if the PKK is pushed against the wall, then they can switch into a more urban strategy, which will both be politically and regionally could be detrimental to Turkey. I mean, I find how to explain Turkey's fluctuations between reset and policy shifts. This Chinese proverb, which is extremely popular in Turkey in a mistaken form, which says a crisis is an opportunity riding a dangerous wind. And the mistaken form is like Turkish popular culture believe opportunity and risk are the same word in Chinese. But the real Chinese proverb, I think, explains the Kurdish policy, the Turkish policy very well. So the crisis here is the Kurdish politics, Turkey's Kurdish question. The opportunity it brings, this crisis is, Turkey increase its military capabilities, develop drones and allocate resources to that, and then now that those drones are providing an opportunity beyond the Kurdish issue, that Turkey's footprint is increasing regionally and globally almost. And another opportunity coming with this is that Turkey is able to use the terrorism discourse and perceived security threats, perceived and real security threats, to put pressure on its allies to open to get support from Turkish incursions in both in Iraq and Syria. So crisis is bringing some opportunities, but it is also riding a dangerous wind, and dangerous wind is the political context. Turkey has aligned almost everyone in its attacks against the Kurds now. That explains the reset as well, I think, to a certain degree. So previously, a few years ago, Egypt was more, let's say, more pro-Kurdish in Syria than it is today. Saudi Arabia as well, like they were more supportive of the Kurdish opposition, and these, even nominal support, or even having Kurdish leaders talking to Syria, Saudi and Egyptian papers, creates such an environment that it has a positive effect on the Arabs of Syria as well. So now Turkey is aligning these Gulf countries and Egypt, also aligning the West. There are a lot of noise maybe about Turkish incursion, but no substantive move. And Turkey is also aligning Russia because of the Ukraine crisis, and Iran because Iran has its own problems. And against this, the Syrian Kurdish leadership are putting, as the word Ambassador Coskun mentioned, putting all their eggs into American basket. And this will, this alignment is the reason why that reset happened, in order to support the escalation. But these will come in at domestic political costs, like Erdogan was talking about being a world leader, and now he's trying to shake hands with President Sisi, pretending that it is almost like it happened by accident, but actually Turkey has been working to this goal for months, and also talking about meeting with Assad. So all these, would have some domestic costs, and the Kurdish politics, Kurdish question might also create some political costs as well.
Guney, maybe just on this point, a very 1 or 2 minute questions. To what extent Turkey, Iran, and Russia particularly see eye to eye on the Syrian Kurds?
They don't see that much of eye to eye. I mean, as we speak, Russian officials are in Kamishli, for example, negotiating a deal between the Syrian Kurds and the regime. They were very quick previously in brokering a deal. This time, I think their conditions are very high. So, Turkish incursion to a certain degree helps Russia, but what Turkey aims is not in line with what Russia would aim. So, seeing eye to eye, I think Turkey doesn't even see eye to eye with herself. So Turkey's one eye look at to eradicate any kind of autonomy for the Kurds. So reestablishing some sort of central state apparatus, and the other eye talks about autonomy for pro-Turkish groups in the region. So both like a changing of diluting the strong central state in Syria, but also the opposite. So Turkey doesn't see eye to eye with herself. With Iran, it's much more of a problem. It is, as I mentioned, it's not a coincidence that Iran is also dealing with its Kurdish issue, and Turkey is going into Syria. It's not a coordination, but it's not a coincidence. I mean, they're not necessarily coordinating. The regime is the central actor here, because Russian influence might be diminishing in Syria, Iran influence might be increasing, but the regime has its own reflexes. We were in the same meeting with Evren Hocam in February, where I had the chance to ask questions to the Syrian Foreign Minister Faisal Mikdad, and also had a very quick chat with him. Which gave me the impression that they will play the game that they perfected, and but which is the waiting game, waiting until the Kurds are driven. Kurds and Turkey would come at loggerheads, and everyone else will exhaust themselves, and then they'll come into establish themselves in those regions. So that waiting game also, is it could be dangerous, because the political vacuum could be filled in by either by Turkey, pro-Turkish groups, which could be very difficult to reverse, also by ISIS, which will also be huge, and that they can see that their strategy is working against them.
Thank you. Evren, maybe let me bring you into the conversation. I'm also, there have been few questions that has been sent to me, and also I see here as well. So one of them is, what you talk about, the economy. But the question is, for the economy investment to be politically relevant for the government, it has to be quick. So the money has to come in, the cash has to come in very, very quickly. If this is the case, to what extent do you see this is being delivered? So are we seeing any sign that this economically driven foreign policy is bringing new cash into the country?
Oh, well, I really don't know the amount of the money that has this foreign policy has been bringing to Turkey, but I have been following news, and there has been a lot of talk about, like this unaccounted reserves, cash that's coming in. So I'm not really sure how much the amount of the money is, but we do know that specifically from the Gulf states and also from Russia, that cash is coming in. So, but maybe Alper or Guney knows this better, how much is the money. But for example, rather than this, like the lending aspect of it, maybe we can talk about, for example, how the foreign policy is being responding to this interaction between economy and bilateral relations with the countries. For example, look at Turkey's Russian foreign policy, and Turkey's bilateral relations with Russia. Right before the elections, it's not easy for Turkey to change the course with Russia because of the needs of the many sectors, or follow the sanctions policy of the European Union, again because of the economic crisis as well, because this current foreign policy really benefits the domestic economic sectors of Turkey as well, particularly construction sector, textile sector, tourism, international travel. The Istanbul airport has actually become the main airport of Russia. I mean, serving as the major airport of Russia right now, and this and that. I mean, what I'm trying to say, I guess, is that many of these decisions have been affected by the economic needs, not just, like this direct cash or money that's lended by this country or that country, which is usually unaccounted for. That said, let me say something. When I said, Alper said that about the political conditionality, for example, when I said political conditionality and no political conditionality, what I meant is exactly this. First, we don't know in many instances what the political conditionality is with this money. or even the amount of money. There is a lot of political informality there. So the key word is, I guess, political informality. We don't know the amount of the transaction. We don't know what is being asked for. But with the Western funding, we do know these types of conditionalities. That's clear and out in the open. Second one, in terms of this conditionality, it's mostly transactional. It says that I'll give you money and you'll give me something back in return, which is usually about my domestic politics, right? For example, in the case of Uyghurs, that's Chinese domestic politics mostly. Or in the case of, what else you mentioned, I forgot, but I mean, it's basically—
Saudi Arabia.
What?
Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, in the case of Khashoggi, I mean, it's an important component of Erdogan's discourse and foreign policy, yes, but it's basically about Saudi Arabia's domestic politics as well, right? But in the case of Western political conditionality, it's basically institutional, let me say, institutional conditionality or democratic conditionality. Turkey needs to do something in its domestic politics, has to change its public procurement laws, has to change this and that, democratize, or stop prisoning Osman Kavala and things like that, like all about Turkey's domestic politics. What I'm trying to say that this money that's coming in, it's unaccounted for. We don't know where it's coming from, the exact amounts of it, we don't know. In most cases, in many cases, we don't know what the deal is. And it's basically, as I said, informal. So that's why I'm really having difficulties in answering this question of, you know, like what is the amount of the money coming in to help Erdogan to win the elections, either in this form or in that form. I'm really having difficulties in answering that, but maybe Alper knows it better than me.
I know that you follow the electoral trends very closely. Let me just pose you another question, which actually you hear from outside all the time. To what extent this kind of grand posturing is appealing electorally, the grand posturing, like, you know, the grand man image in foreign policy, is it appealing electorally, and to what extent can it help a candidate to win the election?
I mean, it used to be a very important component of government's President Erdogan's strategy and in general AKP's strategy, right? This image of Turkey being a major power, and at the same time, this image of Turkey not getting enough from the global distribution of power, not being treated well enough, or not being treated as it deserves, right? And this actually goes together, this superiority and also this feeling of being treated as inferior. So it basically really overlapped with the social psyche of the AKP supporters, domestically as well, because when you look at to the domestic politics, to the populist policy, you see this how to say, this conflict between the people and the elites, which runs alongside the similar discourses, right? Elites treating people badly, they're not getting enough, they are more superior morally and this and that. So that overlap in foreign policy and domestic policy really played well. But I think I agree to Alper Bey in that sense up until now. Because back then, that discursive component has really had the material or an actual basis, both domestically and externally. So Turkey really playing this card in Syria, in Libya, becoming more expansionist in its foreign policy, even its drone policy, as both Guney and Alper Bey mentioned, you know, like displaying this superiority both to the external and domestic audiences. But right now, other concerns, being then showing your muscles or being this superior state, has become more dominant in domestic politics. As I said, foreign policy is losing its importance in terms of the most important concerns of the Turkish electorate. The most important concerns right now, for example, the number one is the economy, of course, that's what I mentioned. Justice, education, democracy, some other things. I mean, even the AKP voters who used to support AKP's autocratization path, when you look at the polls and some studies, surveys, looking at the motivations of the AKP, who used to be the AKP supporters, thinks that, okay, I mean, we gave them this, I mean, let me say differently, they sort of exaggerated this de-democratization path, and look at what it did to the Turkish economy at the end. So this and that. But I think, going back to your initial question, I think this strong state discourse, both inside and outside, is not functioning as it used to be anymore.
Alper, we have also a question in the chat box, which I think is exactly in line with one of your recent publication with Sinan Ülgen, which is, if opposition comes to power, what change should we anticipate in Turkish foreign policy? And there also, the one that asked the questions, he says, except Syria. So let me also use this as an opportunity. I know you just mentioned that in 2011, you were in Damascus. So you know the intricacy of this Turkish-Syrian relationship as well. So how difficult the path ahead for normalization with Damascus?
Galip, thank you. Just one small parenthesis, let me turn back to what Evren Hocam said, and I totally agree with what the assessment that she's making. There's really, when you contrast the transparency or lack of transparency in the dealings that Turkey has with the West, so to speak, and other actors in the East, particularly in terms of funding channels, that's where the challenge lies. So I totally agree with what Evren Hoca said. That's basically what we're talking about, and I think we're in agreement in that sense. Now, as far as potential change, if the opposition were to win the elections next year, yes, thank you for referencing the study that Sinan Ülgen and I recently did for Carnegie, which was on the foreign policy orientation of Turkey's political opposition. We conducted a study by interviewing the foreign policy experts of the main opposition parties, and very quickly, the finding there was one could expect change. The reason being that the opposition parties seem to agree on three main baskets of issues which we thought were important. The first basket was they believe that Turkey's Western vocation should be rekindled, and that there should be no doubt left as to where Turkey stands in the world. But with a caveat, in the sense that they also argue for the need for Turkey to have non-confrontational relations with Russia, with countries like China, and to expand its interests in its region and beyond. So they do not see Turkey's Western vocation to be coming at the expense of its relations with Russia, China, or other countries. That was one important observation they made. The second observation they made, which flows from that, we believe, is that there was a need for a very accelerated and comprehensive democratic reform process in Turkey, basically for Turkey's own needs, but which would also have implications for foreign policy in terms of both Turkey's image, but also by, if there were to be progress in that area, they argued it would set the stage to manage Turkey's challenges with, for example, the European Union. Some problems would not be affected by this. They would have to still be negotiated, but it would set the stage for a more healthy relationship with the West, if you will. And the third observation they made was more of a structural nature. They argued that the conduct of Turkish foreign policy in the presidential system in Turkey has eliminated the ability of line ministries, particularly the foreign ministry and other related agencies, to make input into Turkish foreign policy decisions. And that Turkish foreign policy has become very personalized under the leadership of President Erdogan. Hence, they believe that if there was a reinstitutionalization in the conduct of foreign policy, abrupt moves, adventurous moves, would no longer be the posturing that one would see from Ankara. So when you put all these together, I think it's safe to argue that there would be a significant change in Turkey's rhetoric and the way in which it would conduct foreign policy. That said, they also referenced certain baskets of issues, ranging from Turkey's challenge from terrorism to long-standing dossiers like the Cyprus issue and the Eastern Med and problems with Cyprus as areas where and issues that are above politics. So there will also be an element of continuity there. Finally, very briefly on Syria, I was listening to an interview that President Assad gave recently. It's quite clear that the loss of love between Turkey and Syria is quite deep for understandable reasons. That said, when we spoke to the opposition representatives, and I think we see this in the AKP's statements as well, there's recognition in Ankara across the board that President Assad and the regime in Damascus had survived, that Turkey needs to talk to the regime in one way or another to address some of these challenges. But that will take a long and painful process on both sides to build even an inkling of trust between Ankara and Damascus that may pave the way to normalcy. A lot of damage has been done on both sides. So I think it will take quite an uphill struggle, but there is one common element that brings these two sides together. Actually, when you look at Turkish foreign policy, I know you can argue otherwise, but at the end of the day, Turkey's official rhetoric is that it supports Syria's territorial integrity. Again, that it believes, and we hear these from the opposition as well, that domestic challenges in Syria, including the presence of the PYD-YPG, is something that Damascus needs to find a solution to, so long as there is not a security threat to Turkey. So that could be the common denominator in which Ankara and Damascus can pave the way forward, which actually was the case in the past.
Just a question on this point. I mean, we are talking about the existence of Syrian National Army, which is very much, a Turkey created organization. I think has a manpower of almost 100,000 people. So how do you see the future of all these structures when we talk about, potential normalization with Assad?
I think that example has been one of the gravest mistakes on the part of Turkey, because once you create a structure of that nature, the next step becomes an entrapment. And that's where Turkey finds itself now. This is not the way in which Turkey used to conduct its foreign policy or security or try and advance its security and defense interests through proxies, in other words. And Turkey has also taken this element to Libya in some form and fashion that you can read about in open sources. I'm not sure. There's no easy solution and no easy answer to this. But this is clearly the greatest stumbling block, both in the eyes of Damascus, but also as far as Turkey is concerned. How do you dismantle a structure of that nature? And how do you ensure that there's no boomerang effect to your own security? Because when the day comes and Turkey declares that it is disbanding this structure, where will these people go? And where will they use their, so to speak, expertise in fighting? That is a serious challenge. And I think that is one of the long-standing repercussions of what has happened in Syria that Turkey will have to contend with.
Well, thank you very much. Guney, there is also a question for you from the audience as well, which basically is asking the impact of Kurdish issue on Turkish relation with EU. So that's the first one. Second, let me also a bit tie my question to you with what I just asked Alper Bey. So we have two, so to speak, a semi-autonomy, or the three semi-autonomy projects in Syria. One of them is in Idlib by HDS. Another one is by Turkey-aligned groups, and the third one is by the by the Kurdish groups. So, which one of these autonomy projects do you think will survive? Let's say 5-10 years from now, and which one of them do you think, or will any of them survive 5-10 years from now? I just want to get your predictive power on this question.
Well, I think,
why
thank you, Galip.
And why you think that it will survive, and the one that doesn't survive, why you think that it will not survive?
Well, Galip, I am more confident about my predictive power when it comes to who is not going to predict who is not going to survive. Who is going to survive is more is tougher here. Who is not going to survive? The first contender would be the Syrian interim government, the pro-Turkish administration in Northwest. And the criteria I use for this is mostly how they resonate, both with the public's needs, their governance performance. And the second contender will be the Syrian Salvation Government in Idlib by the HDS. And the third one will be the autonomous administration led by the Kurdish groups. So the Syrian interim government, I mean, I agree with both you, the premise behind your question and what Ambassador Coskun mentioned, that this is the boomerang effect, or the difficulty of dismantling this structure, Syrian National Army, as well as Syrian interim government. But what I think is that Turkish project has worked very well in terms of fragmenting the Syrian opposition, cutting their ties with the public, disabling them to follow any independent policies on the ground. So they became more and more not indigenous groups, but like foreign-based or groups that determine their policies based on external stakeholders rather than themselves. So this made all 100,000 people in the military and their administrative structures very weak. I mean, they punch well below their weight. The Syrian Salvation Government in Idlib, by comparison, is much weaker and receives much less support, but I think it punches well above their weight. And we've seen this in practice in Afrin 2 months ago, when HDS clearly swept in to capture many areas in Afrin. Why I do think the HDS is also, the Syrian Salvation Government may not also survive, is because the governance wise, it's still the main determinant for me here. It is a decentralized government, that it is decentralized by delegation. So it is there are many different actors on the ground in Syrian Salvation Government. The administrative apparatus is much less sophisticated compared to the autonomous administration or ISIS previously. And another reason is that what I think the competitive edge of the HDS in Syria was the ideological zeal that came from their Al-Qaeda roots that made these fighters different from any other groups. They had more unified ideology and more zeal. So their leader, Mohammed al-Jolani, is coming up as the most pragmatic and international politics savvy politician, which also played a huge role in why HDS is still around. But this is actually a weakness as well, because this pragmatism doesn't go well with zeal, with strong ideological position. So when he deals with Turkey or sends positive messages to the West, I think it cripples its own power to a certain degree. I don't see any power, any possibility of HDS to be present beyond Jolani. So when their current leader is gone, the whole movement will go. When it comes to the autonomous administration, well, they've it is broadly a success story in terms of governance, like integrating different multiple ethnic groups and religious groups, dealing with multiple external powers, and surviving until huge pressure from Turkey and other powers up until now, despite and not receiving much political support from anywhere. But they're also how did they use this time? So they gained a lot of time since 2012 until now, almost 10 years they've been governing areas. How did they use this time? How did they increase their capacity? I think the operational military capacity and administrative capacity hasn't increased that much. But governance is still a very good predictor that they will be around. And that also goes for ISIS that we haven't mentioned. The reason why ISIS can come back in Syria if there's a political vacuum is because of the memory they had.
But hasn't ISIS been defeated?
ISIS has been defeated only because of strong ground forces, huge very consistent attacks by the YPG and consistent attacks by the international coalition. It hasn't been defeated ideologically. It didn't collapse on itself. It hasn't been defeated. For example, the HDS without any.
What do you mean weapons. It hasn't been defeated ideologically?
So, if there's a political vacuum in Syria or elsewhere in a Muslim majority country where the political administration is collapsing, then ISIS has it will be very easy for them to fill in that vacuum because they governed very effectively. They had a certain rule of law. I mean, rule of law based on their own law, obviously. But if you live in ISIS territory, it was a predictable area where if you abide by the rules, you'll be secure. That's not the same in Afrin, let's say, under pro-Turkish groups. Like the rule of law is not necessarily there. And ideologically, it has they survived by the way near decimation of their top leadership. Like almost 48 of their top leadership was killed. Maybe 3-4 people re-established the organization. So they've shown that they can regroup. If you take away the strong pressure from the US and also strong pressure from on the ground from the YPG, then all the conditions are there. They're inmates in the Al Hol camp, for example. That we don't see many people who are repentant, saying, "Oh, we made a mistake." They just go. Some of them went back to their countries, but there's not much repentance. On the other question, the Kurdish issue.
Just 1 minute. Yeah.
Kurdish issue has an oversized effect on Turkish foreign policy. I believe that I use it to predict the regional recalibration, but when it comes to relations with the EU, what Turkey is afraid of, the EU is for the EU to give any sort of political recognition to the Kurds, any Kurdish group, or taking them away from the terrorism list. What Turkey is afraid of when it comes to Russia is not about the terrorism list or political recognition. As you know, PKK is not on a terror list in Moscow, or PYD has an office in Moscow. That doesn't concern Ankara. But with Europe, they're clear and confident that Europe will not support the PKK or any groups that are linked to the PKK politically or militarily. But when Kurdish issue becomes an issue in EU-Turkish politics, it's not because EU is necessarily supporting the Kurdish opposition. If you compare EU reactions against Israeli operations in Gaza, against Hamas, which is also a recognized terrorist group, to EU reaction to Turkish operations in Syria against the YPG, which is not an internationally recognized terrorist group, you see the difference. Like there's much more uproar and strong repercussions against Israel, which is a very strongly linked country. So Turkey is the world's one of the most easiest that can carry out an incursion cross-border operation easier than any country.
Thank you. Evren, any last words?
Not really, I'm fine.
Alper, maybe actually I also ask you a predictive questions. Which Turkish leader do you think will be the first to meet Assad?
You saved the best for last. Is that for me? Excuse me.
Yes.
I wish Evren Hoca had stepped in. I really don't know. I really don't know, but I don't think we will see it take place at the highest level. Clearly, it will take a lot of building block for a leadership level meeting. We know that the intelligence services are meeting, but if it matures enough to show a political image in which the two countries are coming together, I would anticipate that would be at the level of either deputy foreign ministers or foreign ministers.
Well, thank you very much for this lively and very insightful conversation. And thank you very much for the audience for joining us and also sending questions to chat to the Q&A box, but also sending over the email as well. We received like a few questions over the email as well. And please stay tuned in for the Middle East Council's on Global Affairs next webinars and events, and we would love to see you there as well. And I would just thank speakers again for their insightful contribution. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.